This is an adult channel. In this video, I'll be showing Nicholas Meyer's presentation from WonderFest 2022. When I got there, I asked one of the WonderFest founders was sitting right in front of me. I sat up front and I asked him, "Can I take pictures and videos?" And he said, "I think so." And I took that as a yes. So I was really just going to, take a few pictures, maybe a little bit of video, and that was it. But I just kept going, like with the rest of my videos that weekend. So I just recorded it all, and of course, I hadn't planned on doing that. So my hand gets tired. I had to switch hands. So, it might be better to listen to this presentation rather than watch it. And at the end, he had a question and answer session, and I really don't like recording those a whole lot because some of the questions, if you've been to one of these, can be pretty cringy. So, but as it turned out, it wasn't. The questions are pretty good, but I didn't record them. In fact, somebody asked him about, what he did to prepare for making Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, which, if you didn't know it, he's done a lot of things. He's directed movies, he's wrote books, all kinds of things. But in this context, he's the one who directed and wrote, he said, 80% of the script for the greatest Star Trek movie ever made, which is Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. He also did Star Trek VI: The Undiscovered Country. And I wanted to ask him, I'd heard that before Star Trek Discovery started on Paramount Plus, or back then it was, what was it called back then? It wasn't Paramount Plus, it was some All Access? Yeah, CBS All Access. And they were supposed to start a series, and he was involved, but that collapsed, and all we got was Discovery. So I didn't get a chance to ask him. And I wanted to get his autograph. I was told he was going to be there Sunday, but I went downstairs, he was giving autographs on his newest book. And I wanted to buy the book and get his autograph. So I went down there, but the line was so long, I was going to miss Randy Cooper's presentation. And they said he'd be back Sunday, which was the following day. I said, okay, I'll just wait till tomorrow. Well, he wasn't there. So that sucked. But he did say in that question and answer session, they were talking about, how he prepared. And Harv Bennett made him watch all the old Star Trek, the original series, which he'd already done in his lifetime up to that, but he said in the presentation that he watched it again in preparation for the movie, directing the movie, and there were 5 scripts for Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. Anyway, he had found a new appreciation for it, and and as far as behind the scenes and stuff, he said the best Star Trek movie ever made was Galaxy Quest, for behind the scenes and stuff like that. But it was a good presentation, and I hope you enjoy it.
Well, let me introduce Mr. Nicholas Meyer. Thank you for coming.
I'm a writer, so I write it all down. Went to the other auditorium, it was much smaller, I got discouraged. Thanks everybody for showing up. Yes, it is his real chest. last joke. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak to you today. I must state at the outset that I typically read and watch very little science fiction, though I love Jules Verne and his unscientific but likewise presciently entertaining rival, H.G. Wells. Also the sci-fi novels of Arthur Conan Doyle, especially the ones like The Lost World featuring Professor George Edward Challenger, a name to conjure with, battling dinosaurs. On my website, I describe myself as a storyteller, not a novelist, screenwriter, or film director. I have never much distinguished between medium or subject. I don't care if my stories are funny or serious, historical or futuristic. I don't care whether they are movies or books or TV series, though their content may suggest which medium suits them best. I just want them to be good stories. Someone asked me what was my definition of a good story, and I responded, it's a story that once you've heard it, you understand why I wanted to tell it. Joseph Conrad wrote, "My aim above all is to make you see." I tell stories, the purpose of which is to make people laugh or cry, in a word, to make them feel. And if at the end of what is meant to be an emotional journey, you wind up thinking about what you have felt, so much the better. But before we go any further, there are three caveats. Firstly, I'd like to observe that artists lose all proprietary authority over their works when they are finished. Artists put messages in bottles and toss them into life's ocean, hoping someone will find and decode them. But chances are we won't be around in every instance of discovery to say, you're right, you're wrong, that's not gun, that's gum, etc. When and if they do. The artist's opinion by this point is just another opinion. People will make of works of art what they will. They always have. In short, I am not the answer to a book of math equations at the back. I can perhaps say what I intended, or attempted, or thought I was trying to accomplish, but not what any of it means to each of you. My second caveat is this, that like magic tricks, when once explained, an artist's answers tend to disappoint. Art, and science too, for all I know, is much more interesting posing questions than answering them. As you may gather, this, if I have anything to say about it, is going to be a talk about ideas. Answers may be few, but perhaps the questions will hold your attention. Thirdly, and lastly, writers are liars. That's why Plato didn't want us in his Republic. If we can't supply what you want to know, we make up shit. Take, for example, Poe's philosophy of composition. How many people have read the philosophy of composition? So forgive the rest of you, have to forgive me if I go through this. Poe was asked, how he created stuff, or he said he was asked. So he said, I'm going to explain how I wrote my most famous poem, The Raven. And he said it was nothing but logic, pure logic. First, I decided I wanted to write a poem. Second, what his next consideration is, what should be the length of the poem? He says, I have never written novels and never written epics because I believe that a work of art, to be appreciable, should be digestible at a single sitting. default's Paradise Lost, because you can't get it in one gulp. So he wanted it to be a short poem, 100 lines. The Raven is 108. Next, what is the subject of the poem? It is my conviction, says Poe, that the proper province of poetry is the contemplation of the beautiful. Everything else is prose. So I now had a 100-line poem about something beautiful. What is the greatest beauty in Poe's opinion? Sad beauty. I now had a 100-line poem about something sad. What is the saddest beauty that Poe could imagine? Death. Whose death is the saddest that he could imagine? The death of a maiden. I now had a 100-line poem about the death of a maiden. At this point, Poe says, I wanted to have a chorus, a refrain, a stanza, something, a phrase, maybe even a word. What's the saddest word he could think of? Nevermore. Now we got a 100-line poem about the death of a maiden, and the answer is nevermore. And by the way, it is an answer. So somebody's asking questions. That's a no-brainer. Must be the lover of the dead girl. We now have a 108-line poem about the death of a maiden with the lover asking questions to which the remorseless and implacable answer, nevermore. That is kind of repetitive, almost not quite human. So we thought, maybe it's a parrot. Maybe he's talking to a parrot. But he said, a parrot is a comical bird. It didn't have the right, and I don't know what that word, how you spell that. So he said, but they remember that ravens could mimic human speech. Now we had a 100-line poem, the death of a maiden, the lover asking questions of the raven, and now you start to understand something of the perverse psychology of the lover, who was clearly always framing his answers, knowing that he only can get one useful answer from the raven, which is nevermore, nevermore, nevermore. And then finally the question, how do you put the lover and the raven together? First he thought of doing it in the woods, the raven's milieu, but that seemed to lack the voluptuous, claustrophobic intensity that he was after. So he put the lover in his study and the raven tapping at his chamber door, etc. Now it seems to me there's 4 possibilities here. 1, this is how Poe wrote the Raven. 2, this is how he thinks he wrote the Raven. 3, this is how he wishes he'd written the Raven. And 4, this is how he would like you to think he wrote the Raven. What is the answer? I don't know, but I figure it's probably some amalgam of all of these things and difficult to pin down. Hence my caution that, writers are liars. And, Gilbert said he got the idea to write the Mikado because a Japanese sword that was hanging over his desk fell down and almost decapitated him. Gave him the idea for the Mikado. It's a good story. It may even be true. It simply does not explain how he wrote the Mikado. Leo Tolstoy, the author of my favorite novel, War and Peace, once stated that the purpose of art is to teach us to love life. No matter how beautiful or terrible, I think Tolstoy is right. The bottom line function of art is to infatuate us with life. Parenthetically, one must acknowledge that art can have other functions. Art can teach us about life. It can help us to endure, or even briefly to escape life. But for today, let's stick with love because the sun will set at some point. If the purpose of art is to teach us to love life, Star Trek, it seems to me, totally fills the bill. Granted, it is more fiction than science, but I think many devotees first became interested in the universe by responding to Star Trek's message about life, its variety, its its value, and as Spock would say, its possibilities. Tolstoy quibbled with Shakespeare. He said, "To be or not to be is not the question. We're here. The question is, now what?" Isn't that also a Star Trekian question? I am a slow reader, a slow thinker, and a slow understander. It may come as a surprise, but when Star Trek was first telecast shortly after the Civil War, I was not among its adherents. I saw a lot of folks running around cheesy sets, wearing what looked like Dr. Denton's, and a man with pointy ears. I never stuck around to find out more. It was many years later in Hollywood when a friend working at Paramount Pictures encouraged me to meet with Harve Bennett, who'd been assigned to produce the second Star Trek feature film. Harve, a remarkable man who had produced a great deal of television, including Mod Squad and The $6 Million Man, and perhaps more importantly, the first big-time miniseries, Rich Man, Poor Man, had never made a feature film. But we got along very well. Harve showed me Star Trek the Motion Picture. Many people are pleased to knock this film, but I am not among them. Robert Wise went boldly where no film had gone before. If he made mistakes along the way, I would learn from them. But at the same time, Star Trek depicted a world I didn't understand and a philosophy to which I was unable to subscribe. Other than technology, I see scant evidence the human condition has changed. It would take me years and my own involvement with the Star Trek world to change my views about the series and to understand, or to start to understand, what it was trying to accomplish. But Harve persisted and made me watch several of the original television episodes, which proved more absorbing than I had anticipated. I began to perceive striking innovations in the show, things I'd originally failed to notice while channel surfing. The unprecedented melting pot, the multinational cast, the daring first televised interracial kiss, the show's willingness to confront and grapple with social issues that, by setting them in a sci-fi context, allowed viewers to contemplate subject matter that, if set on Earth, might push so many bias buttons that, shackled by our prejudices, we could never contemplate such topics objectively. The best science fiction, it seems to me, and I'm sure this isn't news to you, whether set in the past, the future, or outer space, seems always to reflect the human condition of the time in which it was created, like all art. Predicting the future, whether in life or via what we term science fiction, is a tricky business, and most prognosticators, professional and amateurs, get it wrong. True, Star Trek got cell phones right, but who could have foreseen Donald Trump? Science fiction always winds up depicting the time in which it was made, rather than the time in which it is supposedly set. Harve Bennett had promised that draft 5 of the script of Star Trek II would arrive imminently. I waited, and I waited. It was 3 or 4 weeks later that I woke up and found myself wondering what had become of the script that Harve had promised to send. I called him and found him embarrassed. He said, "Kid," he was always calling me kid. There was a time when I was. He said, "I can't show you the script." What he said was, "My tits in a ringer." I had never heard that before. I said, "So that's draft 5. Well, what about draft 4 or draft 3? And he said, "Kid, you don't get it. These 5 drafts are simply separate attempts to get another Star Trek movie out of this. They're not related. And by this time, I'm jonesing to make a space opera. And so I said, well, can you send them up to me? And in those days, you didn't hit send. A van drives up. And as I said, I'm a slow reader. So I waded through all these scripts. And then I had what I thought was a brainstorm and invited Harv and his producing partner, Robert Salem, to come to my house. And I had a yellow legal pad, and I said, I have an idea. Why don't we sit here and make a list of all the things we like in these 5 scripts? Could be a major plot, it could be a subplot, it could be a sequence, it could be a scene, it could be a character, it could be a line of dialogue, I don't care. Let's just make the list. And then, let me try to combine all the things we like into one script. I thought this was really smart, and they didn't seem happy. And I said, what's the matter with my idea? And they said, well, unless we have a script in 12 days, Industrial Light and Magic, which is the special effects house, cannot guarantee delivery of the shots in time for the June opening, which, P.S., I think was today or tomorrow, anyway, 4 years ago. And I said, what June opening? And they said, oh yeah, the picture's booked into 600. I said, what? Wait a minute, you booked the movie into theaters and there's no movie? And he said, well, that's the way it's always done. So I said, okay. Listen, I think I can do this in 12 days, but we've got to get on with it. We've got to pick the things that we like. And they still didn't look happy. And I said, now what's the problem? He says, the problem is we couldn't even make your deal in 12 days. And at this point, and I've had a lot of time to reflect on what happened next, I said, look, forget about my deal, forget about the money, forget about the credit. I'm already going to be the director, we know that, that's a done deal. But if we don't do this now, there's not going to be a movie. What are you saying? You know. Later, when I told my agent this, he said this was the time when he realized that the priesthood was not a career for which he was cut out, which he had contemplated at one point, because he wanted to kill me. Anyway, I don't remember anything about the 12 days, but it was like fiddling with a Rubik's Cube. And I just looked, and basically, I would say 80-85% of the dialogue was mine, about 15% of it was Harv's, and somehow we cobbled this thing together. Thus began my first Star Trek film. It's proper, I think, to point out that following my directing debut, time after time, applause, applause, this was only my second film, but inexperienced as I was already forming theories about what kind of director I wanted to be. It seems to me that all artistic media leaves something to the imagination. Paintings don't move. Music has no intellectual content, and printed words are merely coded symbols the brain must decipher. The painting moves when it meets your eye. Beethoven becomes profound when it hits your ear. Otherwise, it is merely catgut and tubing, a collage of organized sounds. Words make us laugh or cry when our brains decipher their letter combinations and juxtapositions. In each case, it is the imaginative contribution of the viewer, the listener, the reader that completes the work of art. If we directors aren't careful, movies alone, and I include all forms of television, have the hideous capacity to do everything for you, to leave nothing to your imagination. We call this eye candy. The candy is not good for you. By showing you everything, the movie can lock you out of the experience, rendering you passive while the film does everything for you. You are not permitted to make your imaginative contribution that completes the experience by making you part of it. You're talking to the man who fell asleep in both versions of Blade Runner. As a director, I am always in search of what I can leave out. Just because somebody points to something in a movie doesn't mean you have to show what they pointed to. It can raise suspense mightily if we prolong or never show it. Horror movies have long understood this. The victim's eyes widen with shock or repulsion at something we cannot see. Our imaginations are forced to grapple with what it might be. I might note at this point that imagination needs little or no training or prompting. Just listen to commercials on the radio and see how automatically we are able to envision the ring around the collar, as described by the exasperated housewife. Radio, incidentally, is a great artistic medium, depriving the auditor of sight and forcing our ears to work overtime. Radio plays are totally immersive artistic experiences. In addition to omitting things and leaving them to your imaginations, as a director, I subscribe to the idea that form should to some extent be predicated on content. The aesthetic choices an artist makes should reflect the material at hand. A director's style, in other words, should be subordinate to the demands of the story. If you are filming a Gothic tale set in a vast, mysterious mansion, for example, a fluid, gliding camera may best serve your narrative needs. Conversely, a story set in the confines of a coal mine may prompt the director to think in terms of static, sweat-stained close-ups. For Star Trek, with my nautical associations, and I had always likened Star Trek to the Captain Horatio Hornblower books that I'd read when I was a kid. I thought, well, this is like Hornblower in outer space. How many people here have read the Hornblower books? Come on. C.S. Forrester, the guy who wrote The African Queen, he wrote Hornblower was a captain in the Royal Navy during the Napoleonic Wars, and he had a girl in every port, and if you're 13, that kind of sounds good. And he had lots of adventures, and I thought, okay, so Star Trek is Hornblower in outer space. So I was like having nautical associations. I was imagining battleships in space, or perhaps even better, submarines. The notion of claustrophobic spaces seemed best to me, especially when contrasted with the infinity outside those ships. I didn't much care for the previous Star Trek spaceship interiors, which seemed more like the carpeted corridors of a Holiday Inn than a functioning spacecraft. There wasn't much I could do about the cavernous Enterprise bridge set, which I inherited along with other pieces of the previous film, but I did attempt to add a lot of blinking lights. I wanted everything to be as nautical as possible. I wanted cramped spaces like on real warships with lots of instruments and glowing dials. I tried to make things more authentic. For example, in Star Trek VI, I experimented with the absence of gravity, as I'd seen it on film shot aboard the space station. I also attempted to remove the sound of spaceships, since in space there's no sound, but that didn't work. When you remove their roar, Enterprise and Reliant looked like what they were, models. But I did insist that inside the ship there was always an engine throbbing somewhere, the heartbeat of the ship. Writing the screenplay, certain questions I felt had to be addressed, not the least of which was, How do people talk in the future? I don't know about you, but lots of times in movies I'm disappointed by the way characters express themselves. The filmmakers go to extraordinary lengths to get the look right, whether it be medieval England or ancient Rome. The sets and the costumes are authentic down to the last detail. And then the characters open their mouths, "Hey dude, let's do this." And the total effect is ruined. All that authenticity down the drain. The Romans might as well be wearing Fitbits. Starting with the formal and relentlessly logical Mr. Spock, what language needed to be employed? Unlike the freewheeling Star Wars series, which made no pretense to being related to planet Earth, but takes place, a long time ago in a galaxy far away. I'm missing a page here. Hang on. Maybe a brief pause for station identification. That's right. Anyway, I was looking. It's not even here. I was looking for a kind of an exalted language. Spock already speaks in a slightly exalted language, and I was looking for something, I suppose you would say Shakespearean, something like that. And once you get into Shakespeare, Moby Dick is not far behind, because obviously Herman Melville was a fan. And the thing about Moby Dick and Shakespeare is they're not in copyright. Maybe I didn't write as much of that script as I think. In that tale, Captain Ahab, like Khan, defying all logic and reason, seeks vengeance on the creature that maimed him. But for Ahab, Moby Dick is not a dumb beast, but a mask for something entirely unnatural and malign. Know you, Starbuck, that all things in this world are but as pasteboard masks. It is the thing behind the mask I chiefly hate, he tells his appalled first mate. Talk not to me of blasphemy, man. I'd strike the sun if it insulted me. Ahab rails, to which Star Trek responds, I have seen a madman beget madmen. This also sounds very timely lately. Who could he possibly be talking about today? Note the language. We might call it Shakespearean. It is written in iambic pentameter, the ideal meter for English, and it is, for want of a better term, poetic. Melville was oh so clearly a Shakespeare fan. Given all my associations thus far and my goals, it seemed fitting to borrow Shakespeare via Herman Melville to give the characters in Star Trek a language with which to express themselves. Knowing how folks will speak 200 years from now, or even if there will be any folks to speak at the rate we're going, but taking my cue from Nabokov, I thought it a good idea to invent a language for them, an exalted language. After all, these movies are typically referred to as space operas. Therefore, it seemed fitting, to me at least, that their dialogue be operatic, that they be granted arias. Whether we're talking about Richard III or Hamlet, you can't beat their dialogue. But after 3 films, I still hadn't gleaned all Star Trek had to teach me. It may seem strange how long it took me to understand that while adding submarines or battleships might have enabled me to create Star Trek movies, it was only years after the fact that I finally began to grasp how essential the idea of the show was and what made it precious to so many people. It can scarcely be news to any of you or us that we live in a terrifying world, a world whose very survival appears to hang by a fraying thread, a world where the latest fad is killing school children, This is not a world in which I think it's kind of easy to exist. No wonder we spend so much time amusing ourselves to death with trivial or insubstantial escapism, video games, men in spandex, or cell phones. So-called superheroes, saints for a secular society, where Mickey Mouse and Superman head the pantheon of gods, because mere heroes no longer suffice. What I have recently come to understand is that Star Trek, on a more sophisticated level than Batman, for example, provides what is perhaps a more plausible optimism than Superman. It attempts to show a world where humankind can improve without superheroes to save them, where the definition of progress isn't that just because we can do something, it doesn't follow that we must do it. Technology must not become the tail wagging the human dog. Just because we can blow ourselves to smithereens, it does not follow that we must blow ourselves to smithereens. That men and women are capable of learning from past mistakes. In a controversial word, of evolving. Star Trek arguably doesn't promise superpowers, but it does hold out the promise of realizing our own potential. Star Trek holds out the prospect of possibility, of the belief that human beings may never be perfect, but that striving for perfection in the spirit of intelligent and humane inquiry is a legitimate and desirable goal. The final frontier turns out to be right here. Meet me there. Thank you. I'm happy to answer questions.